Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, thank you for coming to my TED Talk. My name is Joshua Ling, and today I need to talk to you about climate change. The soon-to-be former VP Mike Pence has repeatedly stated that he believes climate change to be a hoax, and has maintained that stance throughout his dubious career, as have many of his compatriots. Now, I won't bore you with a complete list of their statements, as many of you heard them firsthand. He and they are, however, dead wrong, and today I will explain why. Today I will show you the difference between natural climate change and human-caused, hereafter referred to as anthropogenic, climate change. I will detail the two largest contributing human activities to this climate change, and I will describe steps we can take to fix the problem. This gentleman is Milutin Milankovic. He was a Serbian mathematician, astronomer, climatologist, geophysicist, civil engineer, and generally all-around awesome. He discovered that Earth's astronomical position undergoes three major cycles that affect its climate. The first is eccentricity, or the shape of its orbit, on a 100,000-year cycle, a 26,000-year cycle of wobble in the direction that our North Pole points at, and changes in our tilt over a 41,000-year cycle that goes from the major extreme of 24.5 degrees up to 22.1 degrees. These cycles have been the determining factor in past climate change as observed from ice core data. From this trend, we would expect Earth to be cooling off from quote-unquote natural climate change as our axial tilt returns to the more vertical position of 22.1 degrees. This leads to milder summers and winters that allow snow and ice to actually persist through the summers of the more northern latitudes. But what about this point right here, where it spikes up so hard? That is the Industrial Revolution. That's when we started pumping gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere. The buildup of this and other greenhouse gases, hereafter referred to as GHGs, has a lag effect and is just now growing exponentially, much like our population. There's no longer any doubt among people who know how to use calculators. The planet is getting hotter. This is simply fact. No belief of anything is required here. If left unchecked, the planet will continue to get hotter. This has a whole host of ramifications, both existential and economic. But here's the rub. Remember the lag effect I mentioned earlier? It's not like back here during the Industrial Revolution that the planet's temperatures shot up directly the day after the first factories were built. It took over a century for the problem to accumulate to start its exponential growth. This means that even if we fix everything tonight, we're still going to have to deal with these issues for decades to come before the trend reverses. That is not, however, an argument to simply continue business as normal. We still need to fix these issues now and keep them fixed, or we will have even larger problems down the road. Now, to keep this presentation relatively short, today I will focus on just the top two sources of anthropogenic climate change: electricity generation and agriculture, which includes livestock production. Now, first I want to point out that we've been going about this all wrong. Too many people think the solution is to force other people to change their behavior, use electricity, go vegan, limit water use, etc. That is, very bluntly, stupid. Well-intentioned, but stupid nonetheless. We can't even expect people to behave rationally during a pandemic. So obviously telling people to consume less is just dumb, and it won't work. The solution isn't to use less electricity, it's to produce more electricity, to raise everyone's standard of living without also increasing our GHG emissions. Our main bottleneck to real climate solutions is generating cheap, reliable electricity without destroying the environment in the process. That solution is one that we, thankfully, already have: nuclear fission. Now, renewable energy has grown in popularity while also getting cheaper. However, there are a lot of ramifications to solar and wind that are being conveniently overlooked by their supporters. The main problem with wind and solar is that they don't produce electricity consistently. Either too much power is generated, which could damage the physical components of the grid if that power is not diverted, or they don't produce enough power, leaving end users with no lights on. Now, some people believe that batteries will fill that gap, but they're neglecting to take into account the lifespan of batteries, the toxic materials involved in producing them, or the fact that we simply can't store the volume of power needed to keep public infrastructure running. We just don't have that technology yet. For home-scale use, I'll be the first to cheer anyone on to get a solar roof and a power wall to offset your electricity bill. However, to power hospitals, factories, and public infrastructure, we need reliability and constant output. Fission provides that. Another problem with wind and solar is the carbon produced in association with their production, transportation, and installation. Because these sources require so much more materials and land to produce the same amount of power as nuclear, we have to figure that into our decisions about how to power our society. Hands down, nuclear fission requires the smallest amount of materials due to the fact that nuclear fuel is extremely energy dense. It also requires the smallest amount of land. To use land for solar means it can't be used by animals, or for one of our best carbon capture devices, trees. When it comes to land use, nuclear fission is hands down the least intrusive on the environment. As we'll see later with agriculture, this is important because natural land can support more biodiversity, and biodiversity equates to resilience. Another problem with wind and solar is that they have relatively short lifespans compared to nuclear installations. Many blades, after being damaged by hail, are simply dumped into landfills. Granted, recently there have been some advancements in repurposing these blades, but at the cost of carbon output in transportation to reprocessing facilities and the energy and carbon needed to power the ovens used to break them down. Solar panels have all sorts of heavy metals in their production, with no clear plan to deal with all of that waste when solar panels reach their end of life. There's a real concern that this waste will simply be shipped overseas to poorer nations for reprocessing, which exposes those people to very toxic elements. This problem is only made worse by the fact that both wind and solar have become cheaper, meaning more of it is being produced. Now, one of the reasons solar and wind have become cheaper recently is that the principle of economies of scale has taken over. As more companies produce these devices, it naturally becomes cheaper and drives innovation to streamline those production processes, further reducing costs. There's zero reason that economies of scale can't also apply to nuclear fission, especially with the advent of the recently approved Small Modular Reactor, aka SMR, designs. These are self-contained reactors small enough to fit on a truck. SMRs can be built assembly line fashion, drastically reducing their cost. These are small, can be refueled without having to take the entire facility offline like current nuclear reactor designs, and they simply cannot have what we think of as a quote-unquote meltdown due to their better designs that simply shut down without external control devices, unlike Fukushima. I encourage you to look up how these designs do that, because they're simply fascinating. But what about nuclear waste? Which is a very fair and correct question to ask. First of all, nuclear waste isn't a green glowing goo, as many people believe it to be. In reality, nuclear fuel is a solid metal. What it also definitely isn't is a greenhouse gas pumped directly into the atmosphere that we all have to breathe. But what many people don't realize is that nuclear quote-unquote waste is simply fuel for a different kind of reactor called a fast reactor that uses up the remaining power of that fuel, reducing the resulting final waste to a product that is only dangerous for around 300 years instead of tens of thousands. That means, very literally, it's less harmful to the environment than plastic is. Think about that. But what about bombs? Won't more nuclear electricity lead to more bombs? Another very valid question with a very simple answer. No. South Korea runs on nuclear fission, and they don't have a bomb. North Korea doesn't have nuclear electricity. They do have a bomb. But what about scary disasters? Again, another very valid question. However, what many people don't understand is that even the very worst nuclear disaster, Chernobyl, will have, all told, on the outside of only around 160 related deaths. Compare that to the 7 million who die annually from polluted air from GHGs. Fukushima scared many people very deeply, but what they don't realize is that no one died from radiation in that event. Had all the people who were wrongly evacuated just sheltered in place instead, even less people would have died. This piece of disinformation rapidly flew around social media thanks to fearmongers who cropped out the legend and labeled this as radiation. However, this picture isn't of radiation released into the ocean. It's a map of wave heights from the tsunami itself as measured in centimeters. Are we really going to let these fear-mongering idiots control the destiny of energy production in our society? Especially considering all the benefits this technology can provide to combat climate change? I sincerely hope not. In reality, nuclear fission is the safest way to produce electricity with the smallest environmental impact and the largest, most consistent output. With a massive expansion of clean, cheap, and reliable fission from SMRs, we unlock all kinds of new tools in our fight against climate change. First, we will have the energy to desalinate water much cheaper and without having to burn fossil fuels. We have a lot of ocean, but not a lot of natural freshwater. Also, with cheaper electricity, we also make vertical farming viable. More on that later, but it brings us to our next largest source of anthropogenic climate change, agriculture. Now, this is something you can do at home. Go to Google Maps. First, come down here and switch over to satellite view. Ta-da! Next, come up here to the menu, and in the drop-down, turn off the labels so that we have things less cluttered. Now, from up here in space, we see generally 3 colors. There's dark green, there's light green, and then there's tan. Now, tan is obviously desert. This is non-usable land, so it doesn't factor into what we're talking about today. But what about this dark and light green? As we zoom in, we see that dark green are trees. Trees and forests which equate to wildlife habitat. On the other hand, light green is agriculture, farming. This is very obviously not places for animals to live. In fact, farmers go to many great lengths to keep animals off of their farmland. So how much have we changed to allow for all this extra farming? Let's look at it. Is it consistent? Yep, there we go. More agriculture. How about up here? Yep, that's farming. So again, when we zoom out to space, we can see the effect that humans have had on the face of our planet. How about England? England used to be covered in forests. Now, good luck finding a large enough forest to sustain healthy populations of deer. What about China? Yep, same thing. Agriculture, agriculture, farming, 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 all over the place. The United States, the world's breadbasket, where once were forests, it's agriculture, it's farming. And even in places that didn't formally have trees, they did have a different ecosystem. They had grasslands that supported wildlife. Not the same with farming. And speaking of destroying ecosystems, we've all grown up hearing about the destruction of the rainforest. And here it is. This is what it looks like. All of this over here, all of this used to be virgin rainforest. Yet 91% of this destruction is to make room so that they can allow cattle to graze for beef. It's simply staggering when you see the scale of it all. Now listen, I love meat. I would never ask anyone to go vegan because, again, asking people to change behavior is not a realistic solution. But we still have to look at the reality of the situation. Cows produce 38% more GHGs than all human transport combined. Breeding animals for food uses 1/3 of the planet's freshwater and uses 45% of the planet's usable surface. Because a lot of farming is only producing feed for animals, not food for people. That makes it the #1 cause of species extinction, resource consumption, and environmental degradation. So without asking people to go vegan, what can we do? Well, first of all, in the short term, we can eat animals that consume far less resources than cows, such as pork and chicken. Not too bad a trade-off. Switch a few meals from beef to chicken or pork. But that's not the best long-term solution. Now think about how many people eat hot dogs and chicken nuggets. Nobody knows what's in any given bite of one of them, but they're both cheap and delicious. So people consume metric tons of them every year. That's what we need to accomplish with lab-grown meat. This is not, repeat, not, quote-unquote, veggie burgers. This technology is currently in its infancy, but with proper funding for more research, and again with that principle of economies of scale, we can make lab-grown meat both cheap and delicious, not to mention the resource savings in both water and land use. This will drastically reduce methane emissions, reduce the need to grow hundreds of thousands of acres of plants for animal feed, cut out the carbon emissions of farming tractors and the trucks transporting all that feed, and allow all that land to revert to a natural state. Which brings me to my next topic. Vertical farming is, very simply, moving the act of farming indoors. A lot of the plants that humans consume don't grow very tall and can be easily stacked on top of each other. Instead of using sunlight to grow, LEDs provide spectrum-specific light to feed the plants, allowing us better energy efficiency. Also, by moving the operation indoors, no longer are the plants at the mercy of hailstorms, wind damage, floods, droughts, insects, funguses, all the things that farmers have been battling for millennia. Furthermore, it means we don't need to spray tons of pesticides, fungicides, and fertilizer chemicals all over the plants. Chemicals that then penetrate our environment, destroy our soils, ruin our soils, ruin our groundwater, and create dead zones in our littoral coastal waters. Vertical farming is the environmentalist's dream. Vertical farms don't have to be skyscrapers, simply run-of-the-mill warehouse-like facilities in and around major population centers. This cuts down on the distance that food has to be transported, further cutting down on carbon emissions. Also, with modern hydroponic technology that we already have, we can cut down the amount of fresh water used for agriculture by 80%. Just imagine it. Grocery stores that provide fresher, cleaner food tracked by software to help reduce food waste, and all of it cheaper than the food we currently have. But why aren't we doing this right now? Very simply, the electric bill. Fossil fuels are still too expensive to provide cheap enough electricity to make vertical farming cheap enough to be viable. That's why, step 1, the absolute first thing we need to prioritize, is scaling up our use of nuclear fission. Some people are still holding out for nuclear fusion power, which is a different process, but the technological hurdles of fusion are currently too great to make their implementation in the needed time frame in any way realistic for combating climate change. Fission, a technology we've had for almost a century, is a tool we can implement now. Companies like NuScale already have designs that have been approved by the government, but we need to vastly grow this technology in scale and implementation if we are to combat climate change in time. That's where you, the members of the U.S. Senate, are needed. Instead of throwing money away on things like the F-35, Divert some of those funds to subsidizing SMR companies. Make it financially desirable for energy companies currently vested in coal, oil, and natural gas to switch over to production of SMRs. You can make a real difference here. You would be making tens of thousands of jobs in facility construction, SMR production and installation, SMR monitoring and maintenance, grid infrastructure improvement, fast reactor construction and operation, fuels processing, etc. Not to mention the jobs created by implementing vertical farming all across the nation. Jobs for land managers in the stewardship of land previously used for surface farming as they revert to a natural state. Thousands of jobs for people to simply go out and plant trees for carbon sequestration. You would be heroes, with a legacy of saving humanity while creating a stronger economy. I implore you, act now, before the problem becomes too big to tackle. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.